be using a mic. He's not going to be using a mic. So if you don't hear him, you gotta tell him to use a mic, okay? Anyway,
My dad was Guy DeLeo, and he was on the Orphan Trains.
I think you
Use
better
the mic.
Did your dad use the mic?
well, I got one too.
My dad was Guy DeLeo, and
Yeah.
he was on the Orphan Train, and I don't believe there's a lot of people left alive in Minnesota from the Orphan Train. I think he was kind of one of the last ones.
Actually, if you have ever seen this book, it was written by Renee Weniger.
Yeah.
A very interesting book to read. Her mother was the last one living.
And we
In
mentioned
Minnesota.
too, this book, she's not publishing any other ones. They do have some, I guess, at the museum for sale,
I'm
but that's
not sure.
the end of it. They're not gonna publish any other ones after that. So if you would want one, it'd be the time to get one now, so. Okay, okay. We'd like to thank you for coming out, and we'd like to inform you as much as we can about the Orphan Train. And again, a special thanks to Renee Weniger and her daughter, and also Doug, because she's helped us a lot too.
And also Lauren. Lauren has followed us for the past week here. Very, very good gal.
There's a lot of things that we don't have figured out yet because as of just days and weeks ago, we're just finding some of this stuff out. So some of it, there's some loose ends on a lot of this stuff yet. So it's kind of a little wiggly on some spots, but anyway, let's see.
I just have one comment. The Orphan Train was a train that possibly a car was hooked onto, and the orphans were put in one car. So,
They did have other things that they were shipping besides the kids on a lot of the trains. It wasn't the whole train. It was just usually one or two cars full of kids.
and we're gonna show you a short video.
It was March 15th, 1906. The train pulling into the eastern Iowa town of Hopkinton that morning would have attracted an unusual amount of attention. Townspeople would have stopped what they were doing to watch. Shop owners would have stood in their doorways as the locomotive slowed near the depot. A notice placed in the Hopkinton newspaper days earlier had described the upcoming arrival of a company of orphan children. It said, "The object of the coming of these children is to find homes in your midst, especially among farmers, where they may enjoy a happy and wholesome family life, where kind care, good example, and moral training will fit them for a life of self-support and usefulness." Inside the train that day, 8 children would have peered out the windows, wondering about this place so far from New York. The group soon made its way off the train and down the block to the Hotel Hopkinton. After changing into the finer clothes they had been given, they were escorted to the nearby Masonic Lodge, where a group had gathered to see the children being offered. The boys and girls were asked to stand and sing a song, recite poetry, anything that might endear them to the crowd. By the time the gathering had ended, each of the 8 children had gone home with a different set of strangers. Between 1854 and 1929, this scene played out many times across the United States, particularly in the Midwest. These trips, which essentially amounted to the resettlement of 250,000 children, were later collectively described as the Orphan Train movement. By the 1870s, the orphan trains of the Children's Aid Society were rolling into towns in more than 30 states. An average of more than 3,000 children a year were rocked by the iron cradle on journeys away from orphanages. The story of the Orphan Train movement is not simply about orphanages and policies, but rather the story of the thousands of children who made those journeys to places unknown, and forever changed the landscape of rural America. Most of their stories have been forgotten in the attic of American history. However, children, grandchildren, and other relatives of some of these orphan train riders have begun digging up their stories.
We estimate there's over 2 million direct descendants nationwide of an orphan train rider. It's really a story of survival and how these children kind of beat the odds of what they were dealt with being born in New York City during this time period.
Okay.
Now, can you imagine, some of the families had one child, 2, 3, 4 of them. Can you imagine, and a lot of you have kids, they have 2 to 3 little kids, hold hands, and somebody coming out and looking at one of those and saying, I'll pick you. And the other ones, just get yanked away and off they go. And you have no idea, they could stop a mile down and your sister could be a mile away, or it could be 1,000 miles away. But they never saw them, most of the time, they never saw them again. But it's sad, it's just terrible, and how can they do that? But that's the way it was. And a lot of the kids, like my dad, he was very well treated, I mean, exceptionally. But a lot of them, like I think Jan was gonna mention after a while too, they'd come out, somebody'd come up, and they'd kind of come up to you and he'd feel you, yeah, he's good and strong, yeah, I'll take this one, off he went. And some of them too, it's a pretty little girl, you think, yeah, I'll take this one, and off they went.
And
That's the way it went.
it wasn't for a pretty little girl either.
Yeah.
Some of it was not good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of happy stories, but there's a lot of sad ones, so, good.
Okay, as you can see, we have a map up here, okay? This map isn't quite accurate, but I couldn't find a map to show you. But North Dakota, South Dakota, and all these areas, that's where a lot of Kansas City, a lot of them were taken into these areas. And just imagine 200 some children, 250 children to have to distribute to these areas. And actually, one of the things is Billy the Kid was one of the orphans, and you know what he turned out to be like. Not a nice little boy, but anyway, that's kind of another part of the history and story. Okay, and I think we will go to Gaetano's birth certificate. Okay. Gaetano's mother was born in Italy in 1888, and she came to New York. And there she had Guy DeLeo, who was born on April 21st, 1913. And what we're finding, he was actually born in a church. Don't know why. We haven't got questions. But anyway, and that was in the Bronx in New York. He was also baptized on that same day, and sometime back when Sid's father was researching things, he always thought that his mother was Antoinette DeLeo, which is spelled D-I-L-E-O as we found it. Our name is D-E-L-E-O, because they weren't sure of it. But he always thought his dad's name was Filippo, and he was a Brazil cotton person. But we're finding out a little differently. We're thinking that possibly it's Annette's sister, which was Filippino Wakato, and that was actually Guy's godmother. And these are the records that you can see right in this area here, but it's hard to see for you. Okay, and then as you can see from, we're gonna go to the next one. Yeah, actually, Antoinette brought him to the Newfoundland orphanage on April 28th, when Guy was 7 days old, I believe. So he was a baby, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. So, and after a period of time, I believe the orphanage must have changed his name, and this is where we kind of got lost. Okay, he comes in as Gaetano DeLeo, correct? Well, papers come along and there's a Joseph Lee. What is this, Joseph Lee? Well, we're finding that out. After a period of time, Joseph Our Gaetano DeLeo, I think, for covering up because the mother didn't come back and get the child. They're covering up his name, which they covered up a lot, and we'll talk about that probably a little bit later on from Darla. But anyway, they were covering up his name, so they changed his name in the orphanage to Joseph Lee.
And that's why we could never find anything. We looked under Guy DeLeo and there was nothing and nothing and nothing. Why would we look at Joseph Lee? And that's what they changed his
Big
name.
question. Anyway, with that name, he stayed with that name until 1925. Okay, then I'm gonna go into another thing. Since he was only 8 days old, you can't give him a steak, you can't give him potatoes. That's not gonna work. Baby doesn't have any teeth. But anyway, so they had nursing mothers. They were called wet nurses. Anyway, you can kind of see there is a certificate from one of the mothers that took care of Joseph for a period of time until he was able to eat like you and I can. Anyway, in one of those particular homes, they had to go to work and report back to the Newfoundland hospital, their orphanage. They had to report how his conditions were. So apparently he lived with these wet nurses. But anyway, one of the mothers that is showing up there, actually she had lost her baby. So it probably was a comfort to her to have this child in her home and to nurse him. Now we got another thing. We're just going to recoup a little bit on your document that was on YouTube.
The Children's Aid Society wasn't the only organization that would take part in the movement. It was an effort to counterbalance the Protestant-leaning Children's Aid. A Catholic organization, the New York Foundling Hospital, began to send their own trains out specifically to Catholic families. Other organizations also followed suit. But by the time the last train left for Silver Springs, Texas in 1929, 250,000 kids found homes. And many of these kids had nice, normal lives. Some wouldn't even find out they were adopted until they were much older. And I'll be telling you a little story about that as this goes on.
Okay. And then also from 1854 to 1829, 250,000 abandoned or orphaned children in East Coast cities found themselves on journeys across the country, shepherded by private organizations like the New York Foundling and the Children's Aid Society. Sid's dad came from the New York Foundling, and they tried to close things so that he could never find anything, but we have found it now. These orphans were resettled with families who promised to give them shelter and education and place them and grow up. It was a very big undertaking. It was the procedure to our country's modern foster care system. The experiment became known as the Orphan Train movement. New York in the 1880s was a difficult place to live. There was an influx of immigration, high rates of infectious diseases, and poor conditions, led the children being abandoned at tragic amounts. Some estimate the number of children on the street at that time up to 30,000 in a city of 600,000 people. Now figure that ratio. It's a lot of kids. I'm not sure of the ratio. A missionary named Charles Brace, which you did see before, struggled with these kids firsthand and decided that something had to be done. So in 1853, he founded an organization called the Children's Aid Society and began forming a plan for the abandoned children and from New York to the communities outside the city that could take them in and give them homes.
And a lot of those kids ended up on the streets. They had the newsies, I think they called them, little newsboys and shoeshine kids. That's what a lot of them did. And it will maybe show you pictures, little kids are sleeping in corners and they're just, it's everywhere. You wouldn't believe it's that thing, but it is. It was tragic.
So in 1854, Grace sent 45 children from New York to a tiny town, Dewapia, I'm probably saying it wrong, Michigan. And we'll tell you a little bit later on about what we found in Michigan. The journey required multiple trains, boats, make the journey. Upon their arrival, all of the children found families, and the orphan train movement was officially on the way.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe there was not a cost to these kids. Like, my grandma didn't have to pay money to get my dad. It was all for nothing. There was no cost to it at all. This is Peter Utes and Cecilia Utes, that was my grandma and grandpa. This is the wedding picture of them. Eventually, they got interested in the Catholic Church and was aware of the orphan children crisis through the fondling home. And she wrote a letter to them asking for a dark-eyed, dark-haired little boy. And
This is
that's
pictures.
my grandma when she was
Yeah, and probably about the time when they would have gotten, I'm just looking at her age. Nowadays, we have few pictures, unfortunately. I wish we'd have more. So take pictures, because someday somebody might be looking for you.
Okay. And,
Okay.
my grandma wrote a letter to the sisters, and it said, "We received your letter telling us to meet the little boy in Hutchinson or St. Paul. It is very unexpected for us to leave home at this time, but if you can't possibly bring him to Noel as you promised to, we will have to come and get him. I would feel it's much better if you would travel with him, but if that's impossible, we'll make the trip to St. Paul. But make sure that we know what day and what time to get him. Thanks to Darla for figuring that out. She found that one.
And for Lauren.
Yeah.
Darla transcribed some of these because they were really hard, so she did an excellent job of that too. And Lauren has just been working hand in hand with us. Okay, but anyway, so guys, Joseph Lee is on his way to Minnesota on that train, or a train similar. Okay, we got this from a gentleman in Montana did researches on things, and we were looking for how Guy got here, when he got here, etc. We were able to, on Tuesday, the 28th, 1915, he had left, and I'll read his commentary on that. Gaetano was rousted out of bed. I'm going to show the first picture of that. Gaetano was rousted out of bed, bathed, dressed and fed on the morning of Tuesday, September 28, 1915. Now, just imagine, he's only 2. So, you know what? You don't rush a toddler and you don't rush an older person, is what my sister said. But anyway, try and rush a little guy like that. He then took a streetcar to the Grand Central Station in New York City, 42nd Street, just a few blocks from Manhattan Theater District today. Gaetano boarded a New York Central Railroad passenger train at 2:45 p.m. for the trip out west.
Now, how could they get that? At 2:45 he did that, and in 7:05 he had this. I mean, how they dug this up, it's unbelievable. Because but that's what he does for a living.
But that's why it's taken over 8 years to figure this out. Okay, as Amtrak today, railroads in 1915 actually named each passenger train. At Grand Central Station, Guy boarded New York Central train number 11, the Southwestern Express. Train number 11 was very slow train, thus the tickets were cheaper. As it made more stops en route than it did faster trains. The New York Foundling Hospital used Southwestern Express to Chicago frequently due to the closeness of the hospital, its cheap tickets, and its favorable departure time from New York and arrival time in Chicago. Okay, the next one, the Southwestern Express traveled through Albany and Buffalo, New York, where it turned southwest along the south shore of East Erie, known as the water level route. This route was the quickest rail route between New York City and Chicago. It remains so today. The train passed through Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Toledo, Ohio, across northern Indiana. It stopped at the South Bend and drove into Chicago. Gaetano's train arrived at New York Central Railroad Chicago LaSalle Street station at 5 o'clock on Wednesday the 29th at 1915. So they were in Chicago the next day pretty much. From the LaSalle Street station, Gaetano swiftly transferred the 7 blocks to Chicago Union Station on Canal Street.
At Chicago's Union Station, Dad boarded the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, and train number 1, the Columbian, left the Union Station at 6:30 on Wednesday, September 29th, and Dad arrived in St. Paul at 7:05 on Thursday, September 30th. And have the nuns and the nurses traveling with Dad would then have left St. Paul on another train to go back to New York the next day.
So they basically delivered Guy, and I think that's kind of what Cecilia, or Tilly was her nickname, requested that somebody attend to him. And sometime down, I was going to say it, but Guy himself, for some reason, age 2.5, something like that. He was born in April and he came in September when he would have been 2. But just imagine him remembering Hannah. And he remembered that and he inquired about it.
Okay. Now this picture, this is my dad. When he got to St. Paul, my grandmother went up to pick him up. And she said, I wanted a brown-eyed, brown-haired little boy. And to ensure that he got to New Ulm, had long hair, he had a little dress on, and a pink bow in his hair. So the nun says, look a little closer, she said. And they handed him out to him. And that's what they did. They just, like a sack of potatoes, that's the way it went.
Can you imagine that? I
Yeah,
can't.
and that's the way he looked. And it's just insurance to get him back to New Ulm. So.
Okay, here are a couple letters. She actually would respond to the orphanage on his conditions. And here was one of them that, again, Darla Gephardt has translated because I couldn't read it. Does a good job of doing that. But anyway, she wrote October 5th, 1915 is one of the letters that we did find. Just a few lines to let you know how the little one is getting along. Well, he seems to be reconciling his surroundings and circumstance and is quite content. He has a very bad cold, which makes him feel out of sorts once in a while, but we are trying to do all we can to make him feel good. He talks so much about Hannah. Here comes that name. And we are wondering who that can be. So there was a Hannah that was in his life that must have been kind of special. I mean, 2 years old. He must have been kind of a smart little 2-year-old. Okay, here is another one that was written December 2nd from her of 1916. So that's almost a year and a half later. Venerable Sister Vincent Teresa. Just a few words to let you know that Joseph Lee is getting along nicely and loved as much as always. He still is a very good boy and is very healthy. He is so big and fat that I'm afraid you wouldn't hardly recognize him should you see him now. We are more than satisfied in every respect, and as you want to hear from us twice a year, we give you that glorious report of him. Now, if anybody knew Guy, he was not fat. As you can see, there's a lot of papers with this research. So.
And Dan, there's a picture of him at 5, We talked about this morning. We've got a lot of pictures. I just have a tough time seeing that as my dad. It just doesn't look like it.
I don't know
And
either.
I don't know how,
It says it.
did they dress little kids like that with the dress back? I mean, when he
Well,
was 2, but now that
I'm
he's
wondering-
5, would that have changed?
Or possibly he had like, they wore shorter knicker type things and he had a coat on. I don't know. But
That's the
that's,
picture we've got,
yeah,
so.
that's what we've got.
So
Okay.
he attended Cathedral through kindergarten through high school. And that is his first communion picture. Now, see, that does not look, can you back up again once and look at that one, and look at that? Does that look the same?
Okay.
I don't think it is.
Well,
but-
it says it on the back of the picture. Somebody's
Yeah.
telling us a fib. So, okay. Now we're going to go to a change of name. Okay, that picture prior to this was his first communion. We're thinking he was probably 8. Okay, so there was a certain point in time that you could adopt this child. I think it was kind of like called a trial period. I'm not sure, because I know that the Yutzes would have adopted him as quick as they could have. But anyway, on this particular thing, Peter and Cecilia, or Tilly, went to the courthouse and they changed his name from Joseph Lee. They wanted to keep it as close and simple, I'm sure. And they changed it to Joseph, we believe, John Yutz. Which later on, he formed a band called the J.J. Yutz and the Arabian Nights. And this shows you one of his band trailers that he had for his band. He was very big into music. And we're also finding that we have found somebody that's, Sid doesn't know, like this one I said, first cousin once removed to Sid in Michigan. And we'll
She's
talk a
trying to
little more.
explain this remove thing to me from
If somebody can explain that to him, I would love to have you do it because I have drawn it up.
Would it be a second cousin?
Yeah.
No, it is.
Yeah. But
From what I understand, it'd be the child of your first cousin. That would be your
Yeah.
first cousin once removed.
yeah, there we
But
go.
that child would be a second cousin to your child.
He's got it. He's got it, guys.
This cousin you have there, now that child would be your first cousin once removed. But your son Chris would be their second cousin.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris and Nina. By the way, I'd like to have our 2 children stand up and introduce them quickly.
That's,
Okay, that's our daughter Misty and our son Chris. But anyway, they would be grandchildren of God. So, thank you, kids. Okay, and then,
remember a while back, we had the big bands and stuff at the museum, and there's a little girl dressed up like Dad with the white suit and all that. That's her.
we asked our son if he wanted to come up here and talk to him. So, but anyway, in going back to this, he was adopted by the Yutzes October of 25, and he would have been
Legally adopted.
legally adopted in 1925. So anyway, that would have been 4 years after he had his first communion. So, okay, going with that, it's paperwork of his adoptions there.
My dad attended McPhail School of Music in Minneapolis after high school, and his parents, the Yutzes, were not wealthy people, but they were able to give him the best. He went on to direct Cathedral and St. Mary's and Hanska schools. He was in music all of his life. At the age of 18, he formed the group called J.J. Yutz and the Arabian Nights. And what happened was, how it all changed was he had the same kind of music that he always had. He always played the same kind, but J.J. Yutz just did not take off. It just flopped. He just couldn't get it off the ground. It just didn't go at all. So he changed his name back to Guy DeLeo, and the band took off just like that. And it was just the name, but there was a little issue with that because the Utzes were quite upset because he alienated
Yeah.
the Utes name and went back to another name. So there's a lot of bad feelings about that.
Yeah, but
And
again.
nobody told us that. I guess we just kind of found some of this stuff out.
Yeah, actually, when we were researching, we had to go to the courthouse, and we had to get Sid's birth certificate, excuse me, his dad's birth certificate, or adoption papers, birth certificate, what we could find here. We had to get the marriage certificate for his grandparents, and I don't know what, and at that point in time, somebody said something to me about it, and that's when we found out about it. We didn't know. So, but those are, let me see, we're in the band. Okay. And then,
And that was my mom and dad. My mom's name was Flavia. On a lot of these posters of my dad and the band, you'll see another lady. That was Julie Helgen. That was not my mom. But a lot of people thought it was. They were married in 1940 in Cathedral. And we've got some.
they were married as Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Utes. And then from that marriage, there were 4 children.
And that's Doug, my oldest brother, Tommy, Phil, and me.
And then you see the marriage certificate here of them getting married. Okay. I know a lot of this probably isn't to do with the orphanage, but this kind of shows you what other orphans probably had to go through that were adopted. Other children not knowing their real name. Well, then after contacting the new foundling, Joseph contacted them after he was married, and several times he was able to find his mother's name and her birth name and his birth name. He even contacted the Italian embassy since he found his maternal mother was from Italy.
But the records, everything they say, the building burned down, everything's destroyed, there's no history of anything. And that's what they told everybody, just to make it go away, you know? And they did.
Yeah.
But Renee, she flew out to New York. She wanted us to go a couple years ago, and we didn't. But that was
I know.
not true. There is records of all this stuff. But
Right.
people, when you say that, you're gonna quit. You won't follow this, you know, it's just not to follow. But if you dig into it enough, you can find it. Dad was given his name through our research, and it was, again, the DeLeo was not D-E-L-E-O, it was D-I-L-E-O. Well, we're not gonna change it now. It's gonna stay in a.
Costs too much money.
And he asked about his mother if she was still living, and the orphanage told him that the adoption parents were wonderful to him, and advised him that he should appreciate them and love them and not research anything else. And I used to get after Dad. I said, Dad, we've got to find out. I was all wild about this way back. And he said, why do you want me to push it? He said, this woman gave me away. He says, why would I do that when the Utzes took me in and were so nice to me? And it does make sense. Why would you want to push it that much? So it kind of died off there for a while. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, until I got a hold of it.
here it goes again. So Dad changed his name to Gaetano DeLeo. And the band, again, he started at 18 years old. And we did find a poster. Should I go get it?
Yeah, I think she's got it on screen too, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is, Sid.
Yeah. and This is the
We found that the other
That's the
day.
original.
It was in
Yeah,
some
Bill,
book
I had
and
never seen it.
stuffed
I had
away in
never
our,
seen it before
where
in
we
my life.
keep our stuff in the shelf.
So that's an original one. So, and I thought, wow, where did that come from? So that's.
So
I still do every
apparently,
day.
his name was Guy DeLeo and his Italian village orchestra before it became, whoopsie, before he changed it to Guy DeLeo and his orchestra. So, okay. So the name change, basically, you go through court proceedings, and if I read that to you, you go, oh, is that boring? I mean, I don't know. Thank goodness I wasn't an attorney.
Oh,
So-
and, yeah, in 1941, my dad joined the Marine Band, and he was the big Marine Band out in San Diego. And, you know, Gunsmoke was James Arness, and Mission Impossible was Peter, yeah, they're brothers. And Peter Graves played clarinet
Was your
in my
dad?
dad's band.
Yeah.
So that was kind of.
Well, and then, well, that's okay, you're just kind of, and then in 1941, he was, actually, he was the director of the Marine Corps Band.
You know, when they come to the different places and schools and stuff, and the Army band plays, and the Marine Corps band plays, that's what he did too. So.
Okay, then, Guy DeLeo, having made his home in New Ulm, he saved The Last Dance for New Ulm.
Do any of you remember that at all? He played the Fasching in 1984, I think it was the last one.
Yep.
And that's the last performance. And I played in the band since 1968, and I played that night. So that was the last.
So, yeah, and Sid played from when?
1968.
No, I mean, it's 1968, you would have been how old?
I'm 29 now. So.
Well, he married an older woman, so.
You were there about 15, right, Sid?
Me, yeah.
In 68?
Yes.
And you know,
15, you're 2 years
I'll be
older,
72.
So you're 15.
and you know how, and you know how he learned how to play drums? He didn't have a drum set. He drummed on boxes. And that's how he learned, right?
Yeah, my dad, I said I want to get in the band, and he said, well, you got to practice. So I picked out the song Sentimental Journey, and I played that hundreds and hundreds of times until I thought I could do it. And I didn't know how to play this, so no, hit this simple like that, hit this like that. So I went through that for a long time, and when I got that down, I played it at the Mankato Ballroom the first time, so that was my first song.
Yeah. Okay, well, the next thing is, okay, there are, what, we know of a few more, but they didn't get back to us, and I'm just gonna read you some of these things to you. Renee Weniger, who did the book, her mother, Sophia Kamensky, lived to be 100, and I'm just going to read you a little bit about her. Her biological parents were William Kamensky and Marie Mary. One parent was born in Germany in 1896. Marie relinquished her 5.5-month-old infant daughter to the New York Foundling Hospital on October 9th, 1915. So that's pretty much about when Guy would be 2. But anyway, we have no idea why. They're having a hard time. She is still having a hard time finding the mother. She can find the father of her mother. And this is again Renee Weniger. Foster parents Joseph and Mary Duda of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then foster adoptive parents, she was adopted out again because those parents, they must have not been able to fit or whatever. Like I said, there was a period of time that they would give children in homes to fit. So then she was adopted by a widow in Springfield, Minnesota. Okay? Well, what we're hearing from there, her mother was not treated very kindly by the widow. But again, that's kind of how things went. Anyway, her adoptive name was Sophia Green, and her mother's adoptive mother was Anna Green. She rode on the, she rode on the Orphan Train to St. Paul, Minneapolis, arriving June 30th, 1917, so she would have been 2. at the age of 2, received by Joseph and Mary Duda of Minneapolis, saved from a return trip to New York in January of 1919. 4-year-old Sophia was replaced to the home of Mrs. Anna Grime in Springfield. Circumstances with her prior placement proved unsatisfactory. Sophia married Charles Hillesheim on June 4th of 36 in Springfield, where the couple raised 5 children. She became a young widow in 1966, raising her children alone after Charlie succumbed to a heart attack. Sophia married widower Raymond Kroll in February of 85 in Sleepy Eye. She became a widow in 2007. In 2016, Sophia died at the age of old age of 101.
That's Renee's mom.
Okay. She was the last living orphan trainer in the state of Minnesota. Okay, then we have a Loretta Armstrong on December 25th, 1913 in Manhattan, New York. Elizabeth Vangel of 423 East 15th Street found the infant Loretta in a waiting room of a 239th Street ferry house in front of Greenpoint Avenue at the Greenpoint Station in Brooklyn. A note attached to the baby girl stated she was 2 weeks old. So a lot of times they were dropped off at orphanages on their doorsteps, pretty much. Okay, and gave her birth name, adding that she was Catholic. Matron Hayes of 161 First Precinct took the infant to the city nurse on January 7th, 1914. Emma Lalepash, some of these words I can't read, RN transported the infant to the New York Foundling Hospital. She was baptized shortly after by a Reverend Christmas at the St. Vincent Ferrer Catholic Church in the chapel of New York Foundling Hospital. So, okay. And she was adopted by Henry and Louise Gossink of New Ulm, Minnesota. And she was named Loretta Gossink. The New York Foundling Hospital was the area that she came from. She rode the Orphan Train in 1915 at the age of 2. The Gossink family received Loretta and returned to their family home in New Ulm, where their new daughter thrived in a content home. Loretta married Leo Koshin in November of 1940. The couple relocated to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and raised a family of 5 children. At the age of 90, Loretta passed away. Another orphan from the New Ulm area. Dorothy Hamburger on August 15th, 1915, excuse me. Her biological parents, they found them, Anna Olsen of Sweden and Charles Hamburg. Foster parents were Benjamin and Matilda Fast of New Ulm. And her foster name was Dorothy Catherine Fast, so they did adopt her. She rode the Orphan Train in 1917 and was transported to New Ulm, Minnesota to the Fast family. Dorothy was married to Raymond Ruby or Gilbertson and Ralph Gebhardt. G-E-P, Hart. She died February 2nd, 2005. And then Sid's dad, you've heard a lot about him, so I won't.
That's my DNA. I'm all Italian. No, I'm not. I'm a mutt. Eastern European, Italian, and I've got, holy cow, I've got everything in me.
He's all over.
But I think if people did an actually DNA test, you'd find out everybody's like that. I mean, it's pretty, but, so I still have it there.
Yes. Well, and then one thing too is the DNA too. For instance, our 2 children could go with Sid and get a DNA or whatever. Not saying they're going to, but if they would, sometimes the daughter will have more CMs count to the father, the son to the mother. Don't know how that works, but that's kind of what your DNA testing comes out to be.
So the other lady that we
Oh,
found,
actually-
Anthony, we'll explain this. We did find out there's another one, and she's in Hale, Michigan. So I called her and I said, same thing, don't hang up the phone, this is not a prank call. And she just broke down crying and carrying out, we couldn't even talk to her. She said, I've been trying to find this all my life, she says, and we never
My
hit
dad
anything. He said, this phone call is from heaven. So we talked and talked, and she must have cried for a half an hour.
Yeah.
So I said, well, let's meet someplace. So we've got a place up in Duluth, and she's in Michigan, so about halfway. I said, let's meet in Duluth, and we'll cash this whole thing out. Oh, she just went wild. So, but all of a sudden,
She
my
got
husband
sick.
has got sick. Okay, now I've got a headache. Now he broke his leg. Now he even sat on the hood of the car. I mean, they're just excuses. And we still have not met, but we talk once in a while. We have not met. And that is her grandpa. That's her grandpa, which would be my dad's brother. Now, I didn't know that I had any relation at all. All of a sudden, my dad's got a brother. What? I didn't know that. And so we're just finding this stuff out now. So this is new. So it's
And if you look at Anthony, I don't see a resemblance, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean he could look like his dad. We don't know.
my Antoinette, my grandmother, would have had Guy, my dad, take him to the orphanage and dropped him off. Then 15 months later, she had another daughter, dropped that one off at the orphanage and left that. Now, dropped him off at the, that's 3. So, we
So,
see this found this out.
and it's kind of showing that they're true brother,
And sister.
100% brother and sister.
So we've got to meet with this lady in Michigan yet, and we'll get it yet, but it
And-
just, it takes a little time.
Okay, and then, going back to it, the one in Michigan, her CMs were 431. Now, this is the one that would be first cousin once removed to Sid. I'll get him to understand this yet. But anyway, at 431, that drop down isn't all that bad. That's pretty close. I'd wonder what her mother and Sid would have been, what CMs those two would have been. We will never know because her mother's passed on. So pretty much,
And we're still trying to find things out, but that's about where we ended up.
pretty much that's kind of how the orphan train children went. Some of them died never knowing. My father-in-law, Sid's dad, he died never really knowing. He knew a little bit, he knew about Hannah, he knew his mother's name was Antoinette, and it was dropped. Well, we've gotten a little further, and someday I hope we can meet the second cousin. Someday I hope we can meet the first cousin if she'd be willing to talk to us. But, I mean, that's kind of, it's kind of was a lost history for the orphan train to close up what they've done. And now I'd like to open the floor probably to Darla to explain something.
Well, can you tell them about the recent change in Minnesota adoption law?
Hold on. We're gonna make her talk on this speaker. I've talked enough.
Can you tell them about the recent change in Minnesota adoption law?
I'll let you do that.
Minnesota's adoption laws come July are going to be open. And they have sent out notifications, and I received one in the mail recently at my house. And it's just a statement saying Minnesota law has changed and adoption records from July forward, they will be open. So people who are searching for their biological parents will be able to find that information and not have to go through the struggle that many people have gone through.
That would be wonderful. Too bad that this didn't happen 50 years ago.
And we do meet September, the middle of September, we meet up in Little Falls annually with all the survivors, the kids, cousins, anybody who wants to meet. And that's kind of a retirement home for nuns. And that's why they decided to have the meeting up in Little Falls. So every year it's a big event. It is. And there's a lot of nice stories, but there's a lot of people crying.
Also, there was a lady, maybe she is kind of brave to say it, that came up to me before and was in Kansas, and there's a museum down there. I don't know if she wants to tell you about it, but. Okay, well, she told me that they were driving down the road, correct?
Going to Texas, right?
So we were going to Texas, to New Braunfels, and we went through Concordia, Kansas. And there was a mural along the road, and had a train on it, and about 2 blocks further down, I told my husband Gary, I said, turn around. So we went in, and they have a mural, and the lady inside was very nice. And then we went down to the railroad tracks, and there was a replica of a wooden cart. The steam engines kind of threw me back here a little bit, because I saw a cart, a wooden train thing, and there were benches, and then there would be little dolls and sitting on the benches with these where the orphans were riding. Down by the railroad tracks also there's cement statues of the little kids, like holding balloons. It's a honoring these orphans. By a library, there was a bench with the story of the father reading a book to the child, and it mentioned the family name. So yeah, this just kind of happened spontaneously. You did mention the Crawl Hillisheim story. I went into the museum and started taking pictures because I saw Springfield, Sleepy Eye, and I'm going, I'm in Kansas. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Is there any questions anybody's got?
Thank you.